We break into standard coverage with a grave report from inside the sanctuary of global power. At this hour, an unprecedented seizure of authority has shattered the royal house, throwing centuries of precedent into chaos. Behind guarded oak doors, the unthinkable has been finalized in complete secrecy. A senior royal figure has been deposed from her rank, and the crown now faces an irreversible internal war. Inside the king's study, the air smelled faintly of old leather and drying ink. The silver fountain pen lingered over the parchment, trembling in the monarch's hand. Charles held his breath, his knuckles white against mahogany, while Princess Anne watched without blinking. Her posture was iron, her gaze fixed on the signature line. With one agonizing stroke, the pen touched the page. Within seconds, a binding decree carrying both their signatures was executed. In one cold strike, Camilla was stripped of her HRH style and deposed as Queen Consort. There was no ceremony, no farewell, and no appeal. There was only a sealed document, a paralyzed household, and a royal marriage transformed into a constitutional disaster. Charles remained seated, staring at the seal as though it belonged to another reign. But the order was immediate. Across every palace department, directives circulated to erase Camilla's designations. Revoking the HRH style severed her from royal rank, while stripping the title of Queen Consort excised her from the sovereign's reign. Losing both severed her from authority and protection she had spent decades securing. A senior aide asked whether the release should be issued. The king did not answer. The silence stretched until Anne placed a hand beside the document, her voice lethal in its resolve. It has already waited too long. Across the corridor, Camilla received the sealed folder from a trembling courtier. She unfolded the parchment, reading the opening twice. Looking up, she asked if Charles had personally approved it. The courtier confirmed his signature appeared above Anne's. Shock became fury. Camilla had expected resistance from the Princess Royal, but not final rejection from the man who promised she would never stand alone. A secondary clause revealed several ceremonial duties had passed directly to Anne, proving the Princess Royal had engineered the transfer long before Camilla knew her position was in danger. Worse still was a second sealed attachment, known only to the king, his sister, and 2 advisors. It dictated Camilla's future residence, restricted access to royal archives, and questioned whether she could appear beside the monarch at state occasions. Folding the decree, Camilla demanded a private meeting with Charles. Before he could reply, Anne made her position clear. She would be present. What began as a marital rift was now an all-out battle for survival. The titles were gone in seconds, but the true struggle would begin when 3 people bound by marriage, duty, and resentment entered the same room. Behind the decree stood 3 people carrying opposing versions of the crisis. Charles saw a decision he resisted until delay threatened the crown. Anne saw a long overdue duty. Camilla saw betrayal by the man whose reign she had defended at enormous cost. Their titles placed them in the same institution, but private wounds pulled them toward opposing destinies. Charles stood beside a framed photograph of himself and Camilla. His hand reached toward it, then froze. As a husband, he wanted to shield her. As sovereign, he knew delay had weakened the palace. Love and duty had collided, and duty had won. Anne returned from the signing and removed her gloves slowly. Asked if she felt relief, the Princess Royal answered that she felt no triumph. To her, rank was never a reward, but a burden earned through service. Meanwhile, Camilla sat with a private dossier spread across her desk, a ledger of disputed seating plans, intercepted notes, and clashes with Anne built quietly over months. Her anger now had structure, making it lethal. When Charles received a message from her reading, "Ask your sister what she promised me at Windsor," the king felt the crisis shift. Before facing his wife, he had to uncover what Anne had promised, and what happened at Windsor that turned that promise into a weapon. The crisis began months earlier during a private Windsor dinner meant to settle disputes over ceremonial precedence, the formal order deciding who represented the crown. Camilla entered believing an earlier promise protected her. Anne had privately said she would support her position as long as rules were respected. But near the end of the meal, tension broke. Camilla accused Anne of treating her like a temporary figure. Anne placed her glass down and answered that respect could not be demanded through printed titles. Charles tried to change the subject, but his retreat wounded both women. Anne saw a brother refusing to defend boundaries. Camilla saw a husband unwilling to stand up for his wife. Camilla confronted Charles in the shadowy corridors immediately following that disastrous Windsor dinner, demanding to know why he had allowed his sister to dismantle her authority without a word of defense. The king insisted he had only been trying to keep the peace, but to Camilla, his retreat was a fatal betrayal. Silence was not neutrality, it was permission. Determined to prove her standing could not be challenged, she bypassed official protocols that very night. Bypassing the king's private office, she instructed her personal secretary to quietly strike Princess Anne's name as lead representative for an upcoming National Veterans Commemoration, assigning the prestigious role to a figure from her own circle instead. It was a calculated demonstration of power, meant to signal that access to the crown flowed through her, not through bloodlines. When the revised official program reached Anne's desk the next morning, she did not raise her voice. She simply drew a thick red line through the altered section and wrote 6 devastating words across the margin. The crown cannot become a family favor. She carried the document directly to Charles, issuing a cold ultimatum. Unless he immediately reversed the alteration and restored strict institutional boundaries, she would formally request a full audit of Camilla's titles, staffing powers, budgetary access, and ceremonial privileges. Terrified of an open scandal, Charles quietly overturned Camilla's program change, but he refused his sister's demand for a wider review, desperately hoping a partial surrender would appease both sides and preserve his fragile peace. That hope was short-lived. Weeks later, Anne received documented evidence that yet another state ceremonial order had been covertly altered without the king's knowledge or approval. This time, the paper trail was unbreakable. Armed with proof that exposed a systematic shadow administration operating within the palace, Anne walked into Charles's private rooms. There would be no more delays, no more diplomatic compromises, and nowhere left for the king to retreat. The room was purged of secretaries, advisors, and security staff. Charles stood beside the cold marble fireplace, his posture slumped under the weight of impending collapse, while Anne stood rigid near the central table. When Camilla entered, the atmosphere inside the room turned arctic. She carried the newly signed decree in one hand, her fingers tightening so hard against the paper that the parchment creaked in the silence. No one offered her a seat, and for several agonized seconds, the only sound was the heavy ticking of the mantel clock. She looked directly into her husband's eyes and asked the question that had poisoned her mind for weeks. "When did you decide I was disposable?" Charles had requested privacy, but Anne refused to leave. Her authority was woven into every line of the document, and she would not allow her brother to falter now. With no courtiers present to soften the blow, the truth was laid bare. Camilla slammed the decree onto the table, demanding Charles defend it to her face. He averted his eyes at first, then admitted that an internal review had uncovered repeated, unauthorized interference in palace administration, falsified directives, and personal favors disguised as official royal commands. Camilla dismissed the findings as a rigged execution, orchestrated entirely by Anne to secure the result she had sought for years. But Charles finally raised his head, his voice strained, yet firm. Smaller restrictions would never have restored trust. Camilla answered with razor-sharp venom, declaring that he had saved the crown by sacrificing the woman who had stood beside him through decades of public hostility. Her tone was terrifyingly controlled, but every sentence fell like a gavel upon a ruined marriage. Anne stepped forward, cutting through the emotional wreckage. Marriage to the sovereign cannot place anyone above accountability. The sovereign must put the crown before private loyalty. Turning on the Princess Royal, Camilla accused her of waiting years for cold revenge. Anne replied that this was not revenge. It was the cost of ignoring warnings given in private long ago. Then came the deadliest strike. Camilla revealed documented accounts showing Charles had approved several disputed changes during informal late-night conversations. She alleged he had given silent consent, only to retreat and let officials blame her when controversy erupted. The accusation struck at the core of the king's integrity, exposing how his habit of conflict avoidance had birthed the crisis destroying his home. But Anne countered instantly, producing a handwritten directive bearing Camilla's own initials, an attempt to bar Princess Anne from a critical state planning meeting. Staring at the page, Camilla admitted she authorized it, claiming self-defense after Anne undermined her position at Windsor. The crossfire was halted by a single, definitive act. Charles closed his eyes and declared that the decree would not be withdrawn. The decision was final. Camilla slowly pushed her chair back, unpinned a historic royal brooch from her coat, and placed the jewel on the table beside his signature. Her eyes turned cold as ice as she delivered her parting strike. The crown has not yet considered what I know about how this order was truly shaped." Without another word, she walked out, leaving behind her titles, her jewel, and a husband shattered by the cost of his sovereign duty. Anne never raised her voice after Camilla stormed from the room. With terrifying calm, the Princess Royal picked up the abandoned brooch, snapped its case shut, and began listing the precise measures required to enforce the decree. Royal residences required immediate operational changes, ceremonial logs needed correction, and palace staff loyalties had to be rigorously tested. In that coldly efficient moment, Charles realized that while the decree carried his signature, the person prepared to enforce it was his sister, and she had already anticipated every form of internal resistance. Anne moved swiftly because a decree meant nothing unless the palace obeyed. When Charles asked whether she had prepared the transition plan before he agreed, Anne admitted emergency options were drafted weeks ago because she no longer trusted him to act before another crisis erupted. The confession wounded him more deeply than anger, revealing she had lost faith in his resolve long before Camilla lost her titles. Anne took charge of the transition to prevent an administrative vacuum while duties, patronages, and ceremonial roles were reassigned. When a senior official refused to remove Camilla's HRH style without direct confirmation from the monarch, Anne carried the document into Charles's study, placed a telephone beside him, and waited in silence. The king made the call, confirming every instruction had to be followed without exception. Later, the hidden attachment was unsealed. Camilla was ordered to surrender access to private archives, relinquish joint household authority, and vacate her royal suite within 30 days. Yet Charles had secretly inserted one safeguard: financial security and a private residence outside her public role. But a vault audit revealed several sealed boxes were missing. Someone inside Camilla's household had acted first, moving personal letters and planning ledgers before the decree arrived. Camilla had secured leverage, ensuring Charles and Anne understood she held a version of the truth capable of destroying their clean narrative. Stripped of her rank, Camilla returned to her private rooms as palace deference vanished within hours. Staff members avoided eye contact, folders were removed from her desk, and deference disappeared. The most painful humiliation came when she opened her diary and found her next major engagement crossed out in black ink, with Anne's name written directly above it. Losing those appointments meant losing direct public authority. When a senior dresser asked how she wished to be addressed, Camilla stared without answering, then swept the remaining folders from her desk in terrifying, silent fury. Charles sent a handwritten message insisting he never intended to leave her unprotected. Camilla scribbled beneath it, "Protection without dignity is another form of exile," and returned the envelope. As night fell, Anne arrived at Camilla's quarters alone, without advisors or security. The institutional buffers had vanished. Anne placed the abandoned brooch on the table, stating she came because neither of them had told the whole truth. Anne admitted she feared Charles's devotion would blur the line between marriage and monarchy, while Camilla answered that years of vulnerability had forced her to secure a position that never felt safe. Camilla then revealed documented records showing Charles had frequently given informal approvals, only to abandon her when controversy followed. Anne listened in solemn silence, forced to recognize her brother's passivity. Camilla promised not to release the records as revenge, while Anne promised the decree's enforcement would not become a campaign of public humiliation. When they departed, the two women who had fought for control stood on the same side, leaving Charles to face the final admission that would determine his reign. By sunrise, the secret decree had metastasized into an irreversible reality, altering the royal line forever. Across the world, international news outlets broadcasted the astounding revelation. Queen Camilla had been stripped of her style, her rank, and her royal office. Front pages across the United Kingdom carried stark, black-bordered headlines announcing the swift purge within the royal house. Outside the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered in bewildered silence, staring at the imposing stone facade as if searching for answers behind the curtained windows. Inside the palace, an oppressive fatalism settled over every corridor. The fragile illusion of domestic harmony had been shattered, replaced by the grim, unyielding mechanics of institutional survival. Every courtier, equerry, and footman moved with hushed steps, acutely aware that an ancient boundary had been crossed, and that the monarchy had chosen cold preservation over human devotion. At her private countryside estate, far removed from the splendor of London, Camilla sat alone as twilight fell. The power she had painstakingly accumulated across decades of public trial had evaporated in a single evening. dissolved by the strokes of a fountain pen. No longer addressed as Her Royal Highness or Queen Consort, she was now an outsider within the very citadel she had sacrificed her reputation to inhabit. The quiet rooms of her private retreat offered no comfort, only the suffocating weight of exile. Her former aides had been reassigned to other duties. Her official calendar had been cleared. Her patronages were systematically reallocated to senior working royals under Princess Anne's direction. She watched televised reports in detached, numbed silence as constitutional experts dissected her downfall, framing her brief tenure not as a triumphant ascension, but as a cautionary footnote in the dark history of the crown. She understood then the ultimate cruel truth of royal power. Affection was merely a temporary illusion, and authority, once surrendered, could never be reclaimed. For King Charles, the aftermath brought no relief, only an agonizing, soul-crushing burden. Sitting alone in his dimly lit study, staring at the empty chair across his desk where Camilla had once sat, the monarch confronted the true price of his sovereign crown. He had protected the institution from administrative collapse and public scandal, but in doing so, he had excised the singular emotional pillar that had sustained him through his darkest years. Every official document placed before him now carried the cold weight of absolute isolation. His duty had demanded a sacrificial offering, and he had delivered it with his own hand. The palace courtiers, once accustomed to his hesitation, now treated him with a heightened, fearful deference, realizing that their sovereign was capable of severing even his deepest personal bond to protect the throne. His reign would forever be defined by this silent act of self-preservation, a king who chose the icy immortality of the crown over the woman he loved. Princess Anne stepped into the vast power vacuum with characteristic, unyielding discipline, yet without a single trace of victory or celebration. The massive task of restructuring the royal household fell entirely upon her shoulders. She systematically absorbed Camilla's former duties, reorganized the palace staff, and realigned key state patronages with cold administrative efficiency. Her already demanding schedule expanded to an exhausting scale, yet she executed every mandate without complaint. Moving through the historic staterooms, her demeanor remained ironclad, though a profound fatalism shadowed her eyes. She had saved the crown from division, but the victory felt hollow, a grim reminder that the royal machine consumes everyone within its gears. In quiet moments, looking out over the silent palace gardens, even the Iron Princess felt the suffocating weight of an institution that demands complete sacrifice and offers no emotional reward. Across the capital, Prince William observed the transformed landscape with a quiet, sobering resolve. The swift removal of Camilla and the decisive intervention of Princess Anne sent an unmistakable signal through the royal line. The throne is absolute, and no individual, regardless of title or devotion, is larger than the institution itself. For the Prince of Wales, the purge was a profound lesson in the merciless pragmatism required of a monarch. He recognized that the royal house had been cleansed of internal conflict, but at the cost of exposing its most cold-blooded instincts to the world. As he prepared for his own expanding constitutional role, William knew that the realm he would one day inherit had been irreversibly forged anew in the crucible of a silent, devastating palace coup. In the grand ledger of history, this dramatic rupture will not be remembered merely as a private marital breakdown, but as a dark testament to the terrifying endurance of sovereign authority. Empires and dynasties have always sacrificed human happiness to survive the relentless tides of time, proving that the crown remains a heavy, unforgiving burden, requiring total surrender from all who dare to bear it. Camilla's swift fall stands as a chilling reminder that proximity to royalty offers no protection when the survival of the house is at stake. The heavy iron gates remain closed, the guards stand watch, and the ancient machine of state rolls relentlessly forward, indifferent to the broken hearts left in its wake. If you found this deep dive into elite intrigue and historic power shifts compelling, please like this video and subscribe to the channel